I'm Peter Adamson, and you're listening to the History of Philosophy podcast, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Image Problems, Arnauld versus Malebranche on Ideas. Some philosophical dilemmas are hard to resolve because two opposing answers both seem attractive and plausible. Take Cartesian dualism. It's very tempting to say that thinking is an activity divorced from the body, because mental life feels so distinctive. Also, then we might get to survive bodily death, which would be a welcome bonus. But it's also tempting to say that thinking is a physical process, because it is affected by the states of our organs, especially the brain, and because it would also be a welcome bonus if the mind could be studied by science. Then there are dilemmas where both answers seem unattractive. Take another central philosophical dispute of the period we've been covering, the question of free will. Determinism seems to make genuine freedom impossible, thus depriving us of moral responsibility. But if free choices are indeterministic and uncaused, then they would seem to be inexplicable, random, and arbitrary. Another less familiar debate that falls into this second category would be the disagreement over representationalism. This is the view that when we are conscious of something, we are representing it through a mental state, not unlike the way that a picture represents the thing shown in the picture. Thus, if I see or think about a giraffe, there's something like an image of the giraffe in my mind, and the reason I am grasping the giraffe is that the image somehow corresponds to her. This idea is much discussed by philosophers nowadays and has deep roots in the history of philosophy. For instance, the Epicureans thought that we see things when atomic images, shed by bodies, reach the eyes. But it was really in the 17th century that it became prominent, thanks to an intense and long-running controversy between Malebranche and Arnauld. This controversy is, I think, a great example of a philosophical dispute where both sides look to be wrong. Representationalism has what looks like an enormous drawback. Though I seem to be aware of the giraffe, I'm actually only aware of an image of the giraffe. This has obvious skeptical implications. It's as if I went through life only ever seeing pictures of things, and not the things themselves. But denying representationalism also looks unattractive. Everything is fine in the case where I just perceive the giraffe herself. But what's going on when I hallucinate that there's a giraffe, or think about a non-existent giraffe, like one that is painted blue and on roller skates? Here there'd be no object for me to grasp. One idea could be that in such cases of illusion or make-believe, and only in these cases, there is after all a representation which fails to match the way the world actually is. But this looks like cheating. Why would there be a representation in my mind when I get things wrong, but not when I get things right? And there could be skeptical implications here too. How would I ever be able to tell the difference between the illusion case, where I have an inaccurate representation, and a successful case, where I grasp something directly without a representation? As we'll see, these issues did arise in the debate between Malebranche and Arnauld, but in other respects, that debate was very different from the one pursued by today's philosophers of mind. For one thing, the most important piece of vocabulary in the 17th century version of the dispute was ideas, whereas now people are more apt to talk about consciousness, mental states, and intentionality. The term representation was, however, in use. A key claim made by Malebranche and rejected by Arnauld was that ideas are êtres représentatifs, that is, representative beings. Malebranche set out this theory in his treatise Search for the Truth, which provoked Arnauld to write a treatise of his own called On True and False Ideas, which is perhaps longer than it needs to be, but offers powerful arguments and occasional moments of entertaining satire. Here's another difference with the 21st century debate. I've met quite a few representationalists, but none of them thought that we grasp representations by uniting to the mind of God, whereas this is exactly Malebranche's view. This, of course, goes nicely with his occasionalism. God is needed to cause everything that happens in the universe, including even our thoughts. But the point isn't merely that God has to create the thought in my mind. It's that when I think of, say, a giraffe, I'm actually seeing the giraffe in or by God, because what seems to be my idea is actually the idea in God's mind. This might help to explain Malebranche's confidence that we do understand enough about God's mental operations to explain why he has created the world as he has, by imposing simple laws of physics and letting them operate, instead of intervening constantly to prevent unfortunate events from occurring. We don't grasp God in himself or his essence, but his ideas are our ideas, so we can hope to grasp something of his ways. Malebranche's view that we see ideas in God is itself an idea that he got from someone else, namely Augustine. The Augustinian theory of illumination, which had loud echoes in the medieval period, says that it is God who imparts knowledge to humans, not sensory experience or any human teacher. Truth, for Augustine, is like a light that God grants to the mind. Malebranche was more than happy to admit his agreement with Augustine, though he cautioned, "Our arguments are somewhat different." In part, because for Malebranche, we do not see truths, but ideas of truths, in other words, representations. So actually, we might think of ideas as being not so much like pictures as like blueprints. They are the ideas that God used as exemplars or paradigms in creating the universe. This is already a clue to Malebranche's motivation in proposing what looks to be a rather extravagant theory of knowledge. The reason he thinks that ideas must come from God is that they cannot come from anywhere else. Certainly not from bodies. These might be causes of sensations, but for Malebranche, a sensation is not the same as an idea. A sensation is only a modification of the mind and not one that bestows knowledge. This is because sensations are confused, particular, and fleeting, whereas ideas are clear, universal, unchanging, and necessary. A truth like 2 times 2 equals 4 is shared by all humans and not tied to any sensory experience or any cultural context, like language. As this makes clear, for Malebranche, an idea would not be, for instance, that there is a giraffe in front of me eating leaves off a tree. Rather, it would be something like giraffe itself or tree itself, the ideas God used to create giraffes and trees, and also the ideas I come to know when I am learning a science like zoology or botany. I then recognize certain bodies as particular examples of giraffe or tree in light of these ideas. While the Cartesian account of bodies and minds is clearly in the background here, Malebranche discards one of Descartes' distinctive doctrines, namely the theory of innate ideas. For Malebranche, the mind is not the source of any of its own ideas. It cannot be, and for a couple of reasons. One is that this would be circular. How would I go about generating an idea I don't yet have? It's not like a carpenter who already has the idea of a table and then sets out to make a physical table in light of that idea. Rather, here what we would need to make is the idea itself. To do that, I would already need to have the idea as a basis for making it. Another reason is that, as we just saw, ideas are necessary and universal, and they are also infinite, as we can again see in the case of mathematics. Think, for instance, of your ability to grasp that there are an infinity of even numbers. A mere human mind could never be the origin of ideas that have these features. By contrast, God would obviously be a perfect source for ideas that share his infinity, eternity, and necessity. But again, when we say that God is the source of our ideas, this shouldn't be taken to mean that he is creating ideas and putting them in our minds. When we know the ideas, this is because God is allowing us to unite to him, or rather to the ideas in his own mind. So, everything Malebranche thinks about human ideas also goes for divine ideas. In particular, they are representations that God uses in order to know about the bodies he has created. Of course, Malebranche is well aware that this theory is unusual and also counterintuitive, but he takes the same attitude here as he did with occasionalism. Just as we customarily assume that fire is the cause of burning when it touches cotton, whereas in fact it is God causing the burning, so we seem to get our ideas by causing ourselves to think about them, when in fact the ideas are seen in God. Thus Malebranche writes, "It is through prejudice that we believe that our attention or desires are the cause of our ideas. This is due to the fact that 100 times a day we prove that our ideas follow or accompany them." Even if Malebranche did expect people to find his views counterintuitive, he probably didn't anticipate the reaction he received from Arnauld. In his searching critique of Malebranche's search for truth, Arnauld admitted that there was quite a bit of good philosophy in it, which makes you wonder how vicious he'd be in response to a work he found wholly without merit. Arnauld subjects Malebranche not just to refutation, but to outright mockery, as in a fairly amusing section, in which he imagines a painter wishing he could just see what St. Augustine looked like. He receives good news from a Malebranchian friend. Just contemplate his face in God's mind. Similar in tone is his answer to a famous passage in The Search for Truth, where Malebranche says that we cannot perceive things in themselves, as if the soul should leave the body to stroll about the heavens in order to grasp the sun and the stars. Arnauld summarizes Malebranche's line of thought as follows: "You are dreaming when you say you see the sun. But do not grieve, for we will extricate you from this embarrassment. Instead of the sun, which does not appear to regularly leave its own place, we have very ingeniously found a certain representation which takes its place, and it is to this representation of the sun that we have given the name idea. There's more going on here than mere satire. Arnauld thinks that Malebranche has fallen into a tempting but dangerous error by supposing that the objects of the mind need to be present to it. This is why he imagines that the soul would need to fly up to the heavens to be in the presence of the sun. Here, Malebranche is, in common with many other philosophers, including the scholastics, confused about the kind of presence required for cognition. We obviously don't need things to be spatially present to the mind in order to grasp them, but we do need them to be objectively present. This terminology is a little misleading. Here, objective doesn't mean something that is independent of subjective judgment, as it would often mean in modern English. Rather, it means almost the reverse, that something is featuring as an object in the mind. But what does that mean exactly? There's room for dispute about the details, but the main outlines of his own view are as follows. For Arnauld, a perception is just the same thing as an idea, and following Descartes, or at least Descartes as Arnauld wants to interpret him, this is just a modification of the mind. Thus, when I have an idea of something, this means that I am perceiving that thing so as to have it in mind, as we might put it. Though he is no less a Cartesian dualist than Malebranche, Arnauld thinks there is no problem about minds grasping bodies, because the mind is created by God with the power to do precisely that. Again, seeking to insult Malebranche by associating his views with those of the scholastics, Arnauld says that for all of them, thinking is passive, as if the mind's job is to receive a picture or form of what it is thinking about. To the contrary, Arnauld insists, thinking is active. Of course, Malebranche is bound to disagree, given his occasionalism. As one modern-day scholar has explained the contrast between our two antagonists, seeing an idea for Malebranche is just to be receptively in its presence when it is presented to one. Having an idea for Arnauld is to understand it, to strive for it, frame it, and grasp it. But the real core of Arnaud's diatribe is his rejection of Malebranche's representationalism. For Arnauld, things become objectively present to the mind without any intermediary. He traces Malebranche's error to another false assumption, namely that thinking is like seeing, or is even a kind of seeing. When it comes to actual sight, it's rather plausible to think that we see by having an image of the visual object in the eye. Actually, according to Arnauld, this isn't correct even in the case of eyesight, since we don't actually see the image on our retina, but the object itself, through the anatomical apparatus of the eyes and brain. In the case of thinking, though, no image is involved at all. Arnauld invites us to consult our own experience of cognition. When you think about giraffes, what you'll find in your mind is the idea of giraffe, and not anything like a representation of giraffes. As he sarcastically says, in order to find this, Malebranche must put it there himself. Besides which, Malebranche keeps saying that God does everything in the simplest of ways. Why would it be more simple to introduce representations between the mind and the object, rather than just letting the mind grasp the object in itself? It's interesting to read this treatise of Arnauld's alongside the Port-Royal logic he wrote together with his friend Nicole. The same voice often seems to speak in both books, as when Arnauld says that Malebranche's search for the truth is undermined by ambiguous use of terminology. The logic also identifies ideas as a topic of central importance, since all reasoning needs to deploy them. When it comes to the substantive question of what an idea is, though, there may seem to be a conflict between the two texts. Alarmingly, the Port-Royal logic even says that ideas are forms in the mind, which looks to be exactly the position rejected in On True and False Ideas. But the two discussions can be rendered consistent by making the following distinction. Take our favorite example, giraffe. On the one hand, giraffe is the animal outside the mind, loping across the savannah. On the other hand, giraffe is present objectively in the mind as a perception or idea. But it's the same giraffe in both cases. It's just that we can distinguish between the giraffe in itself and the giraffe just insofar as it is being perceived. Arnauld calls that an extrinsic denomination, himself indulging in a bit of scholastic terminology. What he means is simply that something has been added to the giraffe from the outside, as it were, namely that my active perception has made it into an object of my mind. At the beginning of this episode, I noted that both philosophical positions could have skeptical consequences, and this is something that emerges in our texts. Malebranche pointed out that if we think by means of representations, this would help to explain cases of illusion or falsehood, which, as we've seen, is something a view like Arnaud's would struggle to do. In return, Arnauld could argue that Malebranche's representationalism leads to skepticism too. Indeed, he does more or less argue this, as when he writes that for Malebranche, we are aware not of men or of the stars, but only of representations of men or the stars. But this line of critique was posed most clearly by another critic of Malebranche named Simon Fouché. Like Arnauld, he wrote a treatise in response to Malebranche's search for the truth, in which he expresses his admiration for the skeptical Pyrrhonists of antiquity. Of all philosophers, they had the most legitimate and judicious approach, says Fouché, for the rather Cartesian-sounding reason that they carefully reserved judgment whenever they lacked absolute certainty. By this standard, Malebranche's own philosophy would leave us suspending judgment about everything. This is because his philosophy of mind allows only for union with ideas in God, but these ideas are not like the external objects, and thus cannot correspond to them. So, infers Fouché, we should not judge the objects that are outside us by the ideas we might have of them by the imagination or by pure intellection. Here, Fouché makes a good point. In virtue of what exactly are Malebranche's ideas managing to represent the things they supposedly represent? As we saw, Malebranche himself emphasizes the wide gulf between the mental and the physical, saying, along with Descartes, that the color and heat we experience are not really among bodies, given that these are pure extension. Fouché goes further. There's no reason to think that ideas correspond to bodies in terms of extension or figure either. Radical skepticism can be rebutted only by showing that there is an invariable relation between the objects and our ideas. But Malebranche seems to have undermined any possibility of establishing such a relation. This is a final problem and a serious one. Malebranche ought to explain how ideas resemble their objects or name something other than resemblance that would allow the ideas to fulfill their function. It's doubtful whether he or any other 17th century representationalist had a convincing story to offer in response to Fouché's line of objection. Whether modern-day philosophers can do better, you'll have to ask them. I wouldn't dare try to represent them. With that, we've come to the end of this little mini-series on Malebranche, and in fact to something of a milestone in the larger series on 17th century French thought. We've now covered most of the key figures from this context. Descartes, of course, looms over the whole period, to the point that, with the exception of Gassendi, most of the figures we focus on were allies of Descartes: Elizabeth of Bohemia, Courtois, Laforgue, Pascal, Arnauld, and Malebranche. With that, we would seem to be ready to move on to Dutch philosophy, getting ready to tackle the next giant of early modern times and another thinker powerfully influenced by Descartes, namely Baruch Spinoza. In fact, though, there are a number of developments in France from this period that don't fit so well into the story of Descartes and his impact. These include the further evolution of French scholasticism, the movements known as moralism and quietism, and, speaking of Spinoza, the emergence of what looks like a radical, even atheistic philosophy. These are the topics that will be occupying us in the run-up to episode 500, as we stay in France and thus continue to serve up philosophy with a strong flavoring of Gallic, here on The History of Philosophy, without any gaps.